Welcome to episode 33 of School Librarians United. I am your host, Amy Herman. This podcast is dedicated to the issues and challenges school librarians face every day. As a school librarian for 12 years and counting, I found myself asking the question, where is the podcast that will help me do my job? I wanted a podcast which addressed the nuts and bolts of running a successful library program. I don't claim to have the answers, but I hope that this is a platform to share resources and exchange ideas. Now is a perfect time to mention that the ideas expressed in this podcast are my own and do not reflect those of my district. When incorporating research, I always cite my sources. So whether you are a novice or a veteran school librarian, this podcast has something for you. I did want to say from the outset that I know there are quite a few aspiring school librarians currently completing certificate programs who regularly listen to this podcast. And while I did have library students in mind when I selected this episode topic, even if you are gainfully employed, this particular episode still has something for you. If you're a regular listener, you know the title topic isn't the only issue addressed during an episode, and even so, while it is becoming increasingly more popular to move on or explore other employment opportunities when you think the time is right, for many of us, looking for another job isn't something we wanted to do. There is a great deal of shuffling of jobs in June when building assignments and teaching assignments and openings are announced. In my experience, June and August have been the busiest times for teachers and those of us working in schools to be interviewing. I hope, wherever you are in your journey, you find something of value in this episode. If you do, and more importantly, if you know somebody who is interviewing over the summer, please share this episode with them. And be sure to check out the resources in the show notes. Before we dive in, I'd like to mention that some of the listeners who were kind enough to reach out in the last 2 weeks. A very big thank you to Margaret in Michigan. And she wrote, I really enjoy your podcast. It's always nice to hear others in the trenches and share all the wonderful things we do in our school libraries. She's from Brighton, and she goes on to say, I really enjoy your podcast. It's always nice to hear others in the trenches and share all the wonderful things we do in our school libraries. Brighton is very fortunate. We have a full-time certified teacher librarian in all our buildings. For the last 2 years, the elementary school library media specialists have been full-time too. We see our classes for 45 minutes a week. Once a month, we incorporate a STEAM day in the library for our classes. She continues, I would love to give a shout out to my library tribe, Tracy, Courtney, Anna, Kara, April, and Emily. She said, we pack a lot into our 45 minutes. Thanks again for the opportunity and for your awesome podcast. Well, thank you, Margaret, very much for getting in touch. I'm also glad that Margaret mentioned being in the trenches. Indeed, I am not a consultant. I work in my libraries full time. I remember the classes that I took in library school, which made the biggest, most lasting impact on my preparation for a job in the school libraries, and they weren't taught by professors. They weren't taught by anybody in the world of academics, but rather adjunct faculty. They were instructors who were in the trenches, working in their libraries by day, leading our classes by night in the summertime and through remote learning. I want to extend a very special thank you to Heather in Pennsylvania. She listened to one of my recent episodes and created a colorful Sketchnote and posted it on Twitter. I'll attach a link in the show notes. To see my episode take on an entirely different format is very revealing. I can see which points resonated with my listeners. We all consume information, and we all have preferred ways to retain that information in order to reference it and use it at a later date. I happen to be a devoted Google Keep fan, but I can see how Sketchnotes, especially ones which utilize color, could be especially helpful. Thank you very much to Lindsay in New Jersey. She's an elementary media specialist for grades pre-K through grades 2, which is fascinating to me. I can't imagine what your collection looks like. Lindsay listens to the podcast during her daughter's soccer practice, and she finds the episodes relatable and nice to hear, especially when our jobs as school librarians can be isolating. Lindsay said she teaches on a fixed schedule, and she just finished checkouts for the last day of May. She will continue to have classes, like me, until mid-June. For her, it's June 21st, and I think that's because of their horrible winter they had in New Jersey. Lindsay appreciated the timeliness of the last episode recorded on May 20th titled 45 Minutes Feels Like Forever. I've mentioned in recent episodes that checking one's download stats is a lot like stepping on the scale. No good can come from this. So recently, I learned how to determine where the downloads in the United States are happening. Prior to this, the only way to gauge where my listeners were coming from was from Twitter conversations and Facebook group chats and a couple emails that would arrive. To say that I was surprised by what I saw would be a huge understatement. Apparently, I have listeners in all 50 states. I was stunned and elated and overwhelmed all at the same time. What do I need to do to make sure this podcast has relevance to my listeners in Idaho, New Mexico, or Vermont? Making sure this podcast has utility to listeners regardless of where you live or the grade level or your building assignment is very important to me. One way to keep this happening is through networking. I love hearing from listeners. Please consider reaching out either on social media or on email at schoollibrariansunited@gmail.com. And for those of you who are curious, the top 5 states with the highest number of downloads is: in 5th place, the state of Washington; in 4th place, New York; in 3rd place, Texas; in 2nd place, Georgia; and in 1st place, California. My home state of Michigan is in a respectable 7th place. The following is an article which I wrote for Michigan's monthly newsletter for school librarians, and I thought it was extremely relevant to the topic of gainful employment. Today, it is titled, "The Grass is Never Greener," or alternatively, and please forgive the dangling participle, be careful what you wish for. A lifetime ago, I taught in a Catholic school. I've never worked so hard, unless you count the summer I was a waitress at Big Boy's restaurant. However, I was aware that as a certified teacher with a master's degree, I was paid less than a Starbucks barista. I was certain that all I needed was a job in a public school with a more competitive wage, and all my problems would be solved. In 2 years' time, I got that teaching job in a large public school, making more than twice the salary. Except now, I was one of 120 faculty members. Quite frequently, I was reminded that I was on a need-to-know basis. And by the way, I didn't need to know a great deal that went on in my school. My biggest discipline issue at the Catholic school had been a student who had violated dress code by wearing chinos, which happened to have 5 pockets. At my public school, I learned on the last day of the year that one of my students had been expelled from a previous school for stabbing a student with a pair of 12-inch scissors and was seeing our school social worker to address rage issues. But privacy laws meant that these details weren't shared with me. My Costco-sized bottle of acetaminophen was always within arm's reach when I worked at the public school. I remember fondly the closeness and sense of community that I had at the Catholic school. I longed for the communal lunch table in the staff lounge, 6 tables which had been pushed together so that no one felt left out of this meal and this meeting of the minds. I was never one for public prayer. However, our morning intentions were broadcast on the PA. The staff and students knew about every loss, every family struggle, and prolonged illness. I smiled to think of when I was briefly pulled out of class and prayed over by our priest because my car had been stolen that morning. The following spring, his blessings and prayers hadn't alleviated the toothache I would have to work through until my 4 p.m. appointment. However, the realization that he had been sent there by my coworkers who had seen my pain while at the lunch table meant the world to me. What does this have to do with working in school libraries? Perspective. All too often, we lose sight of what truly matters and how our choices will play out. I had wrongly assumed that the grass is greener on the other side of the fence. In actuality, when I finally got my dream job, I had unknowingly traded one set of challenges for another. Our libraries are no different. How often do we catch ourselves wondering, wishing for something else? I wish I could remember where I read it, but our future plans shouldn't be dependent on a coworker's plans. And yet we catch ourselves eyeing opportunities which don't exist, like privately hoping someone decides to transfer or retire. Have you ever emerged from the gravitational pull of social media, convinced that others have nicer libraries or a better building assignment? If only I worked in the middle school or the high school. If I taught in this neighboring district instead. If I had a flexible schedule. If I didn't have to travel. If I taught in an affluent district. If I had a bigger library. If I had a bigger budget. If I had an assistant. If I were full-time in one building. If. Recognize the present for what it is. Realize all the good that comes with the here and now. And know that all the potential positive impact which can be achieved working where you are shouldn't be squandered while you wish your day away. So the focus of today's episode is gainful employment. But truly, the reason why it isn't a bad idea to listen to this episode, even if you have gainful employment, is because life happens. 5 years ago, my dream job disappeared. As an elementary librarian in a single building, on my fixed schedule of 7 classes a day, alternating as both the building's librarian and the technology teacher, just disappeared. The plan was to move me to the middle school library. Being involuntarily transferred does bad things to a person. They become miserable. The loss of control is unsettling. That summer, an elementary school librarian position opened up 1 mile from my home. I spent that summer interviewing, and I started the next year working a mile away from my house. Coincidentally, I wanted to mention something that I saw on Twitter last week. I say I saw it because I showed the greatest restraint and chose not to retweet, reply, or comment in any way. I do, on the other hand, have the perfect platform to address this issue for the greater good. The individual, who is a school librarian, tweeted, quote, "After 28 years in the elementary school, I finally got promoted to middle school," end quote. Now, I should be less sensitive to things that people say on Twitter, but this struck a nerve. I love teaching elementary library, so much so that when I was transferred to the middle school, I elected to leave my district and the 48 banked sick leave days so that I could remain an elementary librarian. The fact that the new job was 1 mile door to door from my house was no doubt a contributing factor. But the word promoted stung. It really bothered me. We use the word to mean advancing, such as in a job promotion, or moving up, as in promotion ceremonies in the elementary and middle school. I'm sure I would love working in a middle school or high school library, but at the time, 5 years ago, the idea of leaving my elementary library for good was upsetting. I work with middle and high school librarians, I network with them, and thanks to my podcast, I've always regarded our jobs as equal. Granted, we acquire different skill sets along the way, but I've never thought as my middle school and high school counterparts as being somehow more valuable to their buildings as I am to mine. As I get older, I'm learning that the words we choose matter. Thank you for indulging me in this rant. Addressing the current library students out there, I suggest you take advantage of all the career supports in your library school. If you're near the physical campus, visit the Career Center. Have your resume reviewed. Sign up for mock interviews. Check out the job fairs. Sign up for the ALA and AASL with your student discount. Additionally, unless you're looking to relocate, join your state school library association and be sure to ask for a student discount. All of these organizations post job openings, and you can subscribe to a listserv as jobs become available. I'm on several school library Facebook pages, and there also have been jobs posted on several of these sites. You can also post interest in relocating and find out where job opportunities are anticipated. And finally, be sure to check out the list of interview questions attached in the show notes. Let's talk about resumes. Something fun I did, rather unintentionally, is I kept a hard copy of every iteration of my earliest resumes. I have a binder with plastic sleeves and, sort of like a professional archive, page through my first resume with my student teaching listed at the top. The real reason this binder actually was necessary was because before computers were readily accessible and printing from home was actually affordable, I would keep hard copies of my resume ready to dash off to Kinko's or some other office supply store to run copies. The binder also includes the original copies of my letters of recommendation, my police clearances, and I even have my first signed teacher contract from Guam Public Schools. I would like to reference a terrific article by Ann Ford titled Resume Yay or Resume Nay, the Do's and Don'ts that can land you the job, posted on November 1st, 2018 on American Libraries Magazine website. I'll attach a link in the show notes. I'll summarize the nays and the yays and focus on suggestions which would best suit school librarians. The first suggestion is to skip the objective statement, which traditionally lists at the very top of your resume. This has always seemed like a completely obvious and unnecessary step. Of course your objective is to get a job. Duh. The second suggestion is to avoid using templates, which can be restrictive and confine your resume format. The third suggestion, and I can speak from personal experience on this one, is to ignore the one-page limit. The rationale makes sense. Today, by and large, applicants are submitting digital copies of their resume for consideration. Back in the day, when I started teaching, we stuck to the one-page maxim because a staple would mar the parchment paper which we had so carefully chosen and paid for. I interviewed for a job about 13 years ago. I made the final round, which, given I had zero experience working in a school library, was some sort of consolation. Anyway, the HR director did me the courtesy of a phone call to let me know that I didn't get the job, and, aware that I would continue my job search, offered me some advice. Amy, your resume didn't do you justice. And why did you use just one page? What I didn't know is that the librarian with whom I had just completed my field experience was a friend of this HR director and had actually called to tell her all about me. The HR director said I wouldn't have ever gotten a first interview without the benefit of the phone call. In Ann Ford's article, the verdict is, so long as the format of your resume is logical and easy to follow, using multiple pages to give a more accurate depiction of yourself, the candidate, is the best course of action. The next suggestion in the article, and clearly a change in generational attitudes, is that longevity is no longer expected. Gone are the days when an employee would land and stay with the same employer for an entire career. I say that and remember that when I started a new job, asking the teachers around me how long they had been teaching in that building, the word forever is what most of them replied. Changing careers is common now, that people are staying in the workforce for considerably longer than even a generation ago. Needless to say, include all your library-related work experiences and those which, tangentially, could provide useful experience even if you didn't remain in these positions for an extended time. When it comes to wording your resume and cover letter, be sure to embed the keywords from the job posting. Taking the time to customize your cover letter and resume for the specific job will pay off. Be especially careful as you update your resume and cover letter that you are keeping building names and districts straight. There are few things worse than sending the wrong cover letter to a job posting. While I've never made that mistake, there was a time I found myself juggling 5 different applications to 5 different districts. The next valuable piece of advice is to be specific. Include data which supports your value and skill set whenever possible. I'll title this next suggestion, Spin. As long as you can tie past work or volunteer experience to bolster skills that you could bring to the job, include it in your resume. Thanks to the wretched job market in the 1990s and baby boomers who were nowhere near ready to retire, I found myself subbing for 1 year. As challenging as this year was, I became adept at thinking on my feet, making on-the-spot decisions, and my classroom management techniques were honed. These skills are important in any school library, and I'm glad I didn't leave that year off of my resume. Another thing that I also managed to weave into my elementary application, I mentioned that I had been the president of our preschool, and that was singularly my only teaching experience that I had with elementary age students. I'd been the president, I worked in a co-op nursery school, and volunteered twice a week when my sons were there. The last piece of advice from this article is to persist. I jokingly tell my coworkers, it only took me 20 years to get a job in the neighborhood district. I interviewed for my current district in 1994, 2006, and again in 2014. Sometimes there are factors which you cannot possibly perceive. All too often, there are candidates lined up for these jobs, and their interviews are just formalities. The best you can do is to try again. I'm not a great hockey fan, but Wayne Gretzky said, "You miss 100% of the shots you don't take." This applies to the job hunt. Shifting to the interview process, I'd like to share what I can. First of all, be optimistic. Hopefully even, for many reasons. First and most importantly, pessimism will come off as negativity. If you get an interview and you're convinced that this is a long shot and that you have little to no chance of eventually actually getting a job, that will be picked up by those who are conducting the interview. Be patient. No effort is ever wasted. There's a chance that you won't get this job, but you are now more likely to be considered for other job openings which happen later in the summer. I didn't get the job I interviewed for in June, but eventually, after the dust had settled, I interviewed again and in August for a different job, and I got that one. Friends tell me of job offers which didn't happen until several weeks into the school year. It certainly isn't ideal, but expect interviews to continue well into August. As nice as it would be to know in the spring where you'll be teaching in the fall, there is a good chance you might find yourself still in limbo in August. July can be challenging, as many administrators, at least in the Midwest, are on an 11-month contract, and decisions aren't made in July. I drove my family crazy for the entire month of July, waiting until the interviews resumed in August. Be positive. Again, your opportunity to make a first impression is so limited, you can't afford to get bogged down in self-doubt. Along those same lines, never say anything negative. Always contextualize difficulties as challenges, which you learned valuable skills. Be aware that any criticism on your part of something in your past could unwittingly come back to bite you. If you have a snarky side, bury it deep. If you can be sarcastic, tone it down. You want the committee to see you as a potential coworker, but be careful that you don't come off as being too casual. Be open. Be open to the idea that not all jobs start off as expected. I learned when I recorded an episode in November called "We Are the Lifelong Learners" from stories of school librarians and their journeys. Many started off as working in the public library in the summertime. Many started off as long-term substitutes, and others just happened to be in the right place at the right time. But in all these circumstances, these school librarians had to be open to the idea of something different than what they had envisioned themselves initially doing. Be ready to be surprised. When I came back to Michigan after teaching on Guam, I found that without local references, most administrators interviewing me had assumed my work was with the Peace Corps and not with former Department of Defense schools. One administrator, with apparently a very poor sense of world geography, declared, "Wow, Guam, I've always wanted to work in the Caribbean." Lucky for me, I didn't correct him, because he hired me 4 years later when he was the Human Resources Director for a district about 15 miles away. That same year, I had a very uncomfortable interview with a building principal. When I explained that I returned to Michigan to get married the following summer, he declared, "Well, you'll be wanting to start a family right away, I assume." I once walked into an interview for an elementary school library position, expecting one principal at the meeting. I got 3 principals. Unbeknownst to me, there were multiple vacancies anticipated in the district, and these administrators wanted dibs in the event this principal opted not to hire me. Before that interview even began, one of the teachers at the table said, "Hey, didn't you used to teach high school social studies?" She went on to make the connection for me. Her brother-in-law was the special ed teacher in my former high school, and this was before I took off some time to be at home with my 3 kids. I used to give him all of my teaching materials in advance so he could prepare his students. Turns out I had a fan at the table, and I didn't even know it. This is interview karma. Your reputation precedes you. Other surprises include, years ago, I walked into a private school and I faced a panel of students who brought their questions that they wanted to ask me. I have also had to teach to these panels. I've had to teach lessons to classes. My sons told me when they came home from school that their German teacher was going to be retiring, and one of the candidates had stepped in and had taught a class for 15 minutes as part of their interview. I want to say something lastly about honesty in your interview. As I mentioned, when I read the column I submitted for my state newsletter, I worked at a Catholic school for 2 years before moving to a large public district. The interview for the large public district, I was asked, Amy, if you're so happy at your current job, keeping in mind you never say anything negative about your current job, why are you looking for another job? And I'll never forget what I said because I was terrified. I replied something to the effect, I love my job. However, as a graduate of the public school system, I'm a firm believer that it remains the best system by which we can educate tomorrow's leaders, and I can't support my family on my current salary. Several weeks into the school year, that teacher who sat in on the interview panel and had asked that question approached me, and he said, if you had lied when you responded about the money question, we would have known it. Now, when it comes to potential interview questions, I will spare you my reading of them. I'll refer you to an extremely thorough 3+ pages of potential interview questions generated by a powerhouse in our profession, Joyce Valenza. Joyce Valenza spent 25 years in school libraries, authored many books, articles, and is now faculty member at Rutgers University. Her CV is 21 pages long, and my brief description will not begin to describe the contribution Joyce Valenza has made to school librarianship. Her 3 pages of interview questions are organized under the following headings: personal questions and teaching style, instruction and learning questions, philosophy and professionalism questions, technology and maker culture questions, literature and reading promotion questions, and finally, questions about your relationship to the community and building staff. Be sure to check out the resources in the show notes, and once you've saved them to your Google Drive, might I recommend color coding the questions and generating your answers in a contrasting color. I'm not suggesting you tackle each question, but wrapping your head around many of these questions that you could be asked is an important part of the preparation process. Another terrific resource I will link to in the show notes is a podcast episode titled Job Interview Advice for Teachers with host Jennifer Gonzalez. I've referred to Jennifer Gonzalez's Cult of Pedagogy podcast in previous episodes. Be sure to check out her infographic. Her archived episodes and printed transcripts provide a treasure trove of topics and hours of customizable audio PD for this summer. One more podcast episode you might find helpful is episode number 5 of the EduMagic podcast, hosted by Dr. Sam Fike. And I apologize for mispronouncing her last name. This episode, Job Interview, nailed it, was helpful and had great suggestions. Again, I'll attach a link in the show notes. I encourage you check it out. Lastly, I did want to address the type of interview which is involved when you switch different grade levels. For example, from an elementary library to, say, that of a high school or a middle school library position. And I'd like to thank Kelsey Aaron, who can be found on Instagram at GVHS Library. She generously provided her own perspective on this type of interview. She happened to mention that high school librarians have the best job ever, and she has absolutely no bias on this at all. Kelsey recommended, quote, talk about how your work at elementary has given you the patience and kindness that will come in handy when working with teenagers who can oftentimes be needy, self-conscious, anxious. Focus on what kind of outreach you'll do to drum up business. In other words, how will you convince teachers to collaborate with you, and how will you support the curriculum? And a question to ask is, what role does the library currently play in the current greater school vision and culture? How does the administration view the role of the librarian contributing to the greater vision of the school's trajectory in the next 5 years? Does the library receive a budget each year that does include funds for online databases, or do you get those funded from a different source? Another question that Kelsey suggests you ask in your interview is, what is the one thing their library has not provided or accomplished in the past that the administration would like to see the new librarian accomplish? Does the school district support professional development opportunities, and will they send you to a conference or two each year? Another good suggestion is to make sure you explain your library philosophy and your vision to them and ask if that aligns with their goals. In other words, do they want a quiet, studious library, an active and social learning space, or a combination library makerspace? And is that the kind of library you want to run? Also ask them what other duties you're expected to do, including proctoring, covering, subbing when needed, textbook collection, storage, tech collection and storage, are all some examples of other duties schools sometimes put on librarians' shoulders. Don't get blindsided. If you can, ask for details on the responsibilities they expect from you. I want to thank Kelsey for providing such an elaborate and detailed explanation of the questions you could ask coming from an elementary and going to a middle or a high school position. I will guarantee you the last question of the interview will always sound something like this. Well, do you have any questions you would like to ask us? Meaning the panel would now like to hear from you. Do you have a question you'd like to ask the panel who holds your future in their hands? This is such a loaded question. And after what feels like standing in front of a firing squad for the last hour, the last thing I want to do is jeopardize my chances of offending somebody now that the interview is basically over. I have yet to find a good way to answer this question. I think it requires you sort of sizing up the moment and using a great deal of diplomacy. I want to thank you for listening today. When emailing the podcast at School Librarians United or using social media, please include a mailing address and I'll be sure to send you a thank you sticker. Make sure that you check out the resources in our show notes. If you found today's episode helpful in any way, be sure to share it with your PLN, your department, or perhaps somebody who's currently in library school. Look for the next episode to be available on Monday, June 10th. And I came up with 3 potential titles, and I'm not sure which one I'm going to decide to use, but something to the effect of Extreme Weeding, Black Diamond Weeding, or Challenging the Classics. I hope you will tune in.